Disability is not an uncommon occurrence. In fact, 54 million people, or roughly 1 in 5 Americans, has some kind of disability. You are sure to encounter people with disabilities in your role as a first responder. People with disabilities are more likely to have secondary chronic health conditions and therefore may be more likely to require emergency medical services. This is why it is so important for first responders to have the knowledge and skills required to effectively assist people with disabilities.
I have a disability and my son has a disability. And I know how important it is that first responders are available, because that's what I want when myself or my son is in need.
Every situation is not the same. Every disability is not the same. Every person is not the same. So you have to have an open mind. As soon as you are in that situation, you have to approach it in a whole different way.
In this training, we'll provide information and best practices to ensure the safety of people with disabilities and first responders. For the purpose of this training video, we'll be addressing 4 major types of functional impairments or disabilities. These include blind visual impairments, communication barriers, cognitive impairments, and mobility impairments. The learning objectives for this training include the following. The first objective is to identify barriers that first responders face in serving people with disabilities and to provide and demonstrate effective methods to overcome these barriers. The second objective is to provide first responders with the information and methods that will help to ensure effective and appropriate communication between first responders and people with disabilities. The third objective is to provide guidance on how to identify characteristics or behaviors of people with disabilities that could be mistakenly viewed as threatening, and to identify best practices to avoid escalating the situation. The fourth objective is to identify groups of people who may need special consideration with regard to transportation or situational orientation, and to identify best practices for addressing those needs. These will include safe lifting, carrying, loading, and evacuation methods. The last objective is to highlight portions of a federal law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, of 1990 that are relevant for first responders. The ADA states that reasonable accommodations must be provided when necessary for people with disabilities to receive the same level of services as the general public. Throughout this training, we will be referring you to a list of additional resources and information made available through our First Responders Training website, www.go.osu.edu/firstresponders. As a first responder, you encounter a wide variety of emergency situations, and naturally, protecting and saving lives is of the utmost importance. The recommendations and tips presented in this training are best practice. However, when faced with a life or death situation, your first priority is saving lives. General disability information and best practices. A disability is defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act as A physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities of an individual, B, a record of such impairment, or C, being regarded as having such impairment. This is a functional definition, which means the determination of whether or not a person has a disability depends on how the impairment impacts their functioning, such as seeing, hearing, thinking, or moving. It is also important to note that most disabilities are not apparent. Non-apparent disabilities may include mental health disorders, seizure disorders, and hearing loss or deafness.
People with disabilities are a vulnerable population and are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the rate of non-fatal violent crime against persons with disabilities is 1.5 times higher than the rate for persons without disabilities. Women with disabilities are 4 times more likely to have been the victim of a sexual assault in the past year. It is also important to remember that people with disabilities are in no way protected from the emotional trauma of abuse. In situations where a person with a disability has been a victim of a crime, be aware that someone close to the person, such as a caregiver or personal assistant, may be the perpetrator. More than half of all incidents of abuse of people with disabilities are perpetrated by a family member. When interviewing someone with a disability, make sure that the victim is in a safe place and feels comfortable answering questions. If it is suspected that the caregiver may be the abuser, provide a separate and secure space for the victim and ensure that the caregiver can no longer harm them.
People with disabilities are extremely diverse. It is important to avoid stereotyping people with disabilities as helpless or unable to make sound choices. Consider this individual. What are our biases about this person's ability to judge a situation or to know what is best for him? Without asking, it is impossible to know what kind of extra assistance this person might require, or whether he needs extra assistance at all. As with all people, it is important to be sensitive and respectful. Here are some tips to keep in mind to help you communicate effectively with people with disabilities. As you arrive on the scene to help a person with a disability, you may need to take a moment before intervening to determine the person's ability to see and hear you and understand what you are saying. Keep your messages simple and direct. If you are having difficulty communicating with a person, it is far better to ask the person to repeat what they said, or to say it in a different way than to dismiss what they are trying to say.
I would just suggest that if you're talking to someone like myself who you're having a hard time understanding, just say, hey, can you say that again? Or I didn't quite get that. Or let them know that you don't understand them. But don't just sit there and say, okay, yeah, don't do that, because that's very irritating, and you might be saying, to something that you don't want to say, to. So.
Ask the person if it would be easier to communicate with picture boards, gestures, or pen and paper. If it is not possible to communicate directly with the person, it is okay to ask a caregiver, interpreter, or companion for help and include the person with a disability whenever possible in the conversation. Be aware of your personal biases and the tone of your voice. Avoid talking to adults with cognitive impairments or other kinds of impairments as children. If you are speaking to a fellow first responder, keep in mind that the person may be in earshot and able to understand what you are saying. Do not assume that a person who is deaf, hard of hearing, or has a speech or other communication barrier is incapable of understanding you. Likewise, it should not be assumed that a person who does not speak clearly also does not think clearly. Some conditions, such as cerebral palsy, may impair a person's gait, balance, or speech without impacting cognitive functioning. Avoid the tendency to speak more loudly than usual. This is rarely helpful and may actually make it more difficult for the person to understand you. Only raise the volume of your voice if the person asks you to do so. For some people, your presence may cause significant anxiety. For example, people with certain types of sensory or cognitive impairments may not notice or appreciate nonverbal cues that identify you as a first responder. Be sure to introduce yourself and let the person know why you are there. Introduce new people who may arrive on the scene and explain what is going to happen. Keeping the person informed can help to alleviate much of their anxiety.
If a first responder walks into a room and they have these coats on and they're running in the house or whatever, my son is probably going to automatically think he's in trouble. It's loud, it's scary. He's like, what did I do? And he may actually flee the situation when in fact he needs help or someone around him needs help. So I just kind of keep thinking of those things. So identifying yourself, saying you're there to help them.
In particular, the thought of leaving their homes can produce a great deal of anxiety for some people with disabilities. For example, someone who is aging may be afraid they will wind up in a nursing home instead of being returned to their home. Or someone with a mobility impairment may have a lift and pulley system installed in their home, making their home fully accessible. Leaving home places them in situations that contain barriers they have eliminated at home. Reassure the person that you are there to help them, not to permanently relocate them to a new home. Another practice that is widely preferred by people with disabilities is the use of person-first language, which defines them as people, not disabilities. For example, say people with disabilities rather than the disabled. Person-first language helps to avoid identifying a person by their disability or using disrespectful terminology. Another example would be to say, person in a wheelchair rather than wheelchair-bound person.